Much. And thanks to you at home for staying with us for the next hour. I do actually have some breaking news to give you right now. This is brand new from NBC News' Pete Williams. Several officials familiar with the initial interrogation of Dzhokhar Tsarnaev at the hospital in Boston describe him as cooperative. A senior government official tells NBC News that Tsarnaev has told them by writing some answers and by nodding yes or shaking his head no to others that he and his brother were not in touch with any overseas terrorists or groups, and that they conceived the bombing attack on their own, motivated, he told them, by religious fervor. They got their instructions on how to make bombs from the internet, he said, according to these officials. Again, that is breaking news from just moments ago from Pete Williams at NBC News. We'll give you more on that as we learn it. Today at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center in Boston, a federal court hearing was called to order in the hospital room. A federal magistrate judge came to the hospital along with the defense attorney and the prosecutor, and late this afternoon they released a transcript of the court hearing conducted right next to Dzhokhar Tsarnaev's hospital bed at Beth Israel. Judge, I will ask the doctor whether or not the patient is alert. You can rouse him. And the doctor says to the patient, how are you feeling? Are you able to answer some questions? The defendant nods affirmatively. Then the clerk of the court says, United States District Court for the District of Massachusetts is now in session. The Honorable Marianne B. Bowler presiding. The case of U.S. versus Tsarnaev will now be heard. Will counsel please identify themselves for the record? Then the defense counsel and the prosecuting counsel identify themselves. They say, good morning, Your Honor. The judge then asks the defense counsel, you have had an opportunity to speak with your client? And the answer is very briefly, Your Honor. Then the judge says to the patient/defendant, so you have your lawyers here. The defendant nods affirmatively. Then it's the judge. Mr. Tsarnaev, I am Magistrate Judge Bowler. This hearing is your initial appearance before the court. We are here because you have been charged in a federal criminal complaint. At this hearing, I will advise you of your constitutional and legal rights. I will tell you about the charges against you and the penalties that the court could impose if you are found guilty. You have been charged with 1, use of a weapon of mass destruction, and malicious destruction of property resulting in death. The judge asks the prosecuting attorney, Mr. Weinreb, what are the maximum penalties? And the prosecutor tells her, death or imprisonment for life or imprisonment for any term of years. And it's the judge again speaking to the defendant. This is not a trial, and you will not be called upon to answer the charges at this time. If at any time I say something you do not understand, interrupt me and say so. Is that clear? The defendant nods affirmatively. The judge, all right. I note that the defendant has nodded affirmatively. As a first step in this hearing, I'm going to tell you about your constitutional rights. You have the right under the Constitution of the United States to remain silent. Any statement made by you may be used against you in court, and you have the right not to have your own words used against you. You may consult with an attorney prior to any questioning, and you may have the attorney present during the questioning. Counsel will be appointed without charge if you cannot afford counsel. If you choose to make a statement or to answer questions without the assistance of counsel, you may stop answering at any time. This right means you do not have to answer any questions put to you by law enforcement agents or by the Assistant U.S. Attorney, Mr. Weinreb. The judge then says, I want to make it clear. You are not prohibited from making statements, but that if you do, they can be used against you. You are not required to make a statement at this initial appearance, and any statement you do make may be used against you. Finally, if I ask you any questions here in this hearing or at any future hearing which you think might incriminate you, you have the right not to answer. Do you understand everything I have said about the right to remain silent? The defendant nods affirmatively. The judge says you have the right to have this court assign counsel if you cannot afford counsel or if you cannot obtain counsel. Can you afford a lawyer? The defendant says no. And this is the first time we know that he can speak, because he does speak. He says just that one word. And apparently he says it with difficulty, because the judge responds by saying, let the record reflect that I believe the defendant has said no. I have provisionally appointed the federal defender to represent you in this matter. Then the prosecuting attorney asks for the young man to be detained pending trial. Given that he's in a hospital bed and can't much move, the defense attorney says effectively, yes, that's no problem with us. We voluntarily agree to that. And then they all agree that the defense lawyers can have access to their client pursuant to hospital regulations and that sort of thing. And then they agree that the next hearing will be May 30th, which is 5.5 weeks from now, at 10 in the morning. And then proceedings are adjourned. at the hospital bed. That's the way we do it in this country, even if justice has to travel to you in your hospital bed as you recover from gunshot wounds to the head and the neck and the legs and the hand. The judge will come to you and the prosecutor, and you will get read your rights, and you will be assigned a defense attorney if you cannot afford one, and you will be tried in court, in civilian court. You are nothing special. Also today, in an American military court at Joint Base Lewis McChord, just south of Tacoma, Washington. Today, the worst fratricide incident of the whole Iraq war resulted in a guilty plea. Army Sergeant John Russell pled guilty to shooting and killing 5 fellow servicemen, 1 Navy commander, and 4 fellow Army soldiers. He was at a combat stress clinic in Baghdad in May 2009 when he opened fire. It's the worst incident of Americans killing other Americans from the whole Iraq war. He pled guilty today. Also today, in Canada, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police held a press conference to announce the arrest of 2 men, one in Toronto and one in Montreal. They were allegedly part of a plot to derail a passenger train inside Canada. Police say the attack was not imminent. It was in the planning stages. They also say the 2 men were getting, quote, direction and guidance from al-Qaeda members abroad. Also today, this nuclear plant in eastern Tennessee, the Watts Bar nuclear power plant, returned to its normal security status as of this afternoon, following what the Tennessee Valley Authority called an unusual event late Saturday night. The unusual event was a shootout on the grounds of the nuclear plant at about 2 a.m. on Saturday night, Sunday morning. A security officer at the nuclear plant was doing a routine perimeter patrol when he came across somebody on the grounds of the plant. He confronted the individual, whereupon the individual shot at him multiple times. He did not hit the security officer himself, but the vehicle that the security officer was in was struck multiple times. The nuclear plant security officer then returned fire. There's no sign that he hit the intruder. The intruder subsequently disappeared, probably by boat, down the Tennessee River. They have not found him. And that's all just in today's news cycle. Everybody freak out. There's no reason to believe that any of these stories are related to each other. In fact, if you had to bet, you would be wise to bet that none of them are related to each other. But this kind of news cycle, just today's news, is a reminder of the broad array of threats that law enforcement has to deal with. Threats that fit somewhere into the matrix of terrorism, might be terrorism, and mass casualty events versus intended mass casualty events. Just from those stories in today's news, the highest death toll is the soldier who shot and killed 5 other service members in Baghdad. There's no death toll or injuries in the nuclear plant shootout, but we worry about that because we worry about where it happened. We worry about nuclear terrorism, about the vulnerability of American nuclear sites to people who would use nuclear material or radiation as a weapon. The plot in Canada was interrupted by police before anybody was hurt. They were under surveillance for a year, apparently, but we worry in particular about that kind of plot, that kind of case, because of the reported links to al-Qaeda abroad as an international terrorist organization with a proven track record of causing mass casualty events, including in the West. But in the case of the Boston Marathon bombing, we know that the death toll is 4. We know the injury count is enormous, over 170 people, including many amputations and other serious injuries. But is it connected to something else, to someone else, other than the 2 brothers who were accused of carrying it out? We know of no links thus far between the Tsarnaev brothers and any terrorist organizations. They are of Chechen ethnic origin, and Chechen groups fighting for independence from Russia have used terrorist tactics in the past, but no Chechen group has taken responsibility for their actions. No group of any kind has taken responsibility for their actions. In fact, several Chechen militant groups have gone out of their way to deny any association with the bombing or with the brothers. There is some evidence of increasing religious radicalism by the older brother, including videos posted online in a YouTube playlist that was maintained under his name, although we cannot be sure that it was definitely his. That said, there is no evidence that we know of, signs that were evident to other people in advance of the bombing, of that kind of growing radicalism in the younger brother, the one who is still alive, the one who had his court hearing at his hospital bed today. But again, repeating the breaking news from just minutes ago, NBC News Justice correspondent Pete Williams is reporting tonight that several officials familiar with the initial interrogation of the younger Tsarnaev brother in the hospital describe him as cooperative. A senior government official saying he has told them by writing some answers and by nodding yes or shaking his head no to others that he and his brother were not in touch with any overseas terrorists or groups. He says they conceived the bombing attack on their own, motivated, he told them, by religious fervor. He apparently, according to these officials, told his interrogators they got their instructions on how to make bombs from the internet. The fact that it is two suspects, these two brothers, has led to comparisons to the D.C. snipers who killed 10 people in 2002. In the D.C. sniper case, it was two assailants. And the older one, the grown man, was seen as the initiator of the attacks and the dominant force behind them. The younger assailant, who was 17 years old when the attacks occurred, seemed to have just gone along with the older man, basically as a father figure. Another reference point in terms of an attack conducted by two people is the Columbine killings. This is another two-person attack. The Columbine attack killed 13 people. And again, in the case of Columbine, you had one dominant personality who was seen as the driving force of the attacks. As Dave Cullen wrote at Slate today, the older of the two boys, Eric Harris, is the one who sought out the arms, collected the ammo, researched the big bombs they used, built all the pipe bombs, drew up the plans and diagrams, conducted the recon, calculated how to maximize the body count, cooked up batch after batch of failed napalm, and generally devised the plan. The other assailant at Columbine, the younger one, mostly seems just to have gone along. After Columbine, there was a long effort to try to figure out what might have motivated that attack. There was what seems to have been a misguided focus on bullying as a possible motive for a long while. Dave Cullen's book on the massacre, it's called Columbine, mostly settled on a simpler truth that the dominant one between those two boys was clinically psychopathic. In terms of the D.C. snipers, if there was any coherent motive for committing those crimes, that motive has been obscured by time, by the incoherence of either suspect, by the fact that one of them has been executed now, and by, frankly, no one seeing it in the long run as the most important thing to discern or to try to remember about those guys and what they did. And it's not strange that we don't have a clear handle on what the motive was in that attack. I mean, was there a motive in the Aurora, Colorado movie theater shooting? That the guy who dressed up as the Joker and walked into that movie theater for that midnight showing and shot up the theater, did he have a motive? The Tucson shooting that killed a federal judge and almost killed Congresswoman Gabby Giffords, was there a motive in that case? The Virginia Tech massacre? The Newtown massacre? We think of all of those assailants as sick. But do we want to know, beyond them being ill, beyond them being sick, why they thought they were doing what they did? The Unabomber, Ted Kaczynski, was clearly sick as well. His motivation was vaguely environmental, or at least anti-technology. Christopher Dorner, who terrorized the city of Los Angeles and killed 4 people, he did that apparently because of a grudge against the LAPD, which was his former employer. The Atlanta Olympics bomber, he was an anti-abortion and anti-gay extremist. That's what motivated the Atlanta Olympics bombing. The Oklahoma City bombing was a militia-aligned racist. He had all sorts of anti-government motivations. How much should motive matter in responding to a mass casualty attack in the United States? Does it only matter if that motive is tied to a larger organized group of people? And this attack that we've just experienced means that we should expect more attacks from those who are similarly motivated. The United States has declared that we are at war with a specific organization called Al-Qaeda. But if in the Boston attack it turns out that, as the initial interrogation reports suggest, there was no operational relationship between Al-Qaeda and the bombers, if no one assigned them this bombing, no one trained them or supplied them or supported their work, if it turns out that one or both of the bombers had a vaguely pro-Al-Qaeda feeling in his head that motivated him to do this on his own or on their own as brothers, then does this get treated any differently than the Columbine attack, than the D.C. sniper type attack? What is the strategic importance of knowing what motivated them? And how do law enforcement and good interrogators pull those threads? Joining us now is Ali Soufan. He's a former FBI special agent whose interrogation proved the first link between Al-Qaeda and 9/11 just after the attacks. The book he wrote about his experience in the FBI is called The Black Banners, The Inside Story of 9/11 and the War Against Al-Qaeda. Ali, it is great to have you here. Thank you for being here.
Great to be here again. Thank you.
When you hear that transcript of what happened at the bedside of the suspected bomber in Boston today, with him being read his rights, being advised that he has the right to remain silent, as a former high-level FBI interrogator, how does that sound to you?
It sounds great. That's exactly how we should deal with these individuals. There is nothing special about them. They committed a crime and they need to be punished for that crime. And this system, our federal system, is one of the best systems in dealing with Al-Qaeda, in dealing with terrorism. I'll give you an example. Since 9/11 until today, we had probably about more than 165, 170 cases of terrorism disruption that happened in the United States. Each one of these suspects were read their rights. Each one of these suspects gave great amount of intelligence to the law enforcement and the intelligence communities that helped tremendously in understanding networks, in disrupting plots, in arresting other people. And then we were able to convict them in a court of law where they are in jail and probably they will never see the day of light again. So this is extremely important. This is also extremely important to counter the narrative of Al-Qaeda.
In what way?
Because they wanted the people to look at them in the Muslim world, that they are mujahideen, they are doing jihad, they are doing something bigger than themselves. But you know what? They are not. They are nothing but criminals. Look at Omar Abdul Rahman. Omar Abdul Rahman, the blind sheikh.
Right.
He is probably, on the religious scale, way higher than Osama bin Laden and Ayman Zawahiri. When he was arrested, when he was convicted in court, not one demonstration in the Muslim world came out in support of Omar Abdul Rahman. How many demonstrations we have in supporting bin Laden's bodyguards in Guantanamo, in heaven's sake? So I think when we do it by the book, when we do it in accordance with our values, when we do it in accordance with our principles, we win, and we win on every level. We counter the narrative, but also we have the ability to convict these individuals and bring justice to all the victims. Today, for example, in Guantanamo Bay, we had hundreds of people who are still in custody in Guantanamo Bay. At one point, we had more than 500-600 people in Guantanamo Bay. We were able to convict only 7 people, and most of them are back at their homeland.
At the military tribunal.
At the military tribunal
which was
system.
in session today, with, again, this very sort of, I don't want to describe it as a sketchy record, but a much less solid record than we've had in the federal criminal court.
Sure, no, absolutely.
One of the things that this administration did early on, and the Obama administration has continued a lot of the national security policies of the Bush administration, to be clear, but they did establish this high-value interrogation target group where we've got high-value interrogation subjects, and they've got a team that they keep very secret and they keep under wraps, that they sort of fly in to conduct the most important interrogations, and we have been told that they will be leading the interrogation of the Boston suspect. How will that team approach interrogating this young man?
I think they will do it like any FBI agent or any law enforcement individual will do it. These individuals are trained to collect intelligence from detainees, but also at the same time now we have a suspect who already read his Miranda rights. He already have a lawyer present, and I don't think that should affect any trained interrogator or any trained interviewer in doing their job. We have been doing this for many, many years. We did it against terrorist suspects, organized crimes, people who were charged with treason, spies, and it always worked, and it always got the intended results.
In terms of this breaking news that we've just got tonight, again, this is a senior government official saying that the initial interrogation of Dzhokhar Tsarnaev in his hospital bed, he says that he and his brother were not in touch with any overseas terrorists or groups. They conceived the attack on their own, motivated, he told them, by religious fervor. That's the language that I have been given. How should that be approached in terms of strategically trying to unwind any threats that might exist beyond these young men? They're saying they acted alone, but presumably the thing that made them want to do this could make other people want to do this as well.
Sure, and I think it's too early to predict at this point. I mean, the interrogation is still very early. This is probably the very first question. People change what they talk about when they are faced with more evidence. There's a lot of things going on at this point, so the interrogation is not the only venue where we're going to know what happened with these people. There's a lot of leads going internationally and probably inside the nation, a lot of interviews. We're probably working with the Russians to know more about the trip of the older brother to Dagestan, where he stayed 6 months. Who are the people that he met with? Who are the people that he probably associated with? How was he recruited? There is probably leads that being sent to people who probably had
If he was recruited.
If he was recruited. So
they're not indicating that they were answering to anybody else.
At this stage, they are not. But I think all the leads will be followed. And, if they are not involved with anything, happening, you need to also be worried about people who would like to copycat these kind of things, individuals who are frequenting the radical websites. Compare their visits to radical websites to, for example, travel pattern, trying to put these things together. This is extremely important because what we did so far, we tactically were able to weaken Al-Qaeda tremendously. Unfortunately, we haven't been doing much in countering the narrative, and we're seeing the narrative spreading around, especially on the internet. And I think this is one of the things that we have to focus on.
And the way that we treat them in terms of responding to this attack shapes our side of that narrative.
Absolutely.
Ali Soufan, former FBI counterterrorism agent, author of the book The Black Banners, The Inside Story of 9/11 and the War Against Al-Qaeda, now heading up the Soufan Group, which is a security consultancy. Ali, it's great to have you back. Thank you so much for being here. It's nice to see you.
Thank you. Great to be here.
All right, we've got much more ahead on Boston and on other matters. Please stay with us.